A young black woman with a ticket for first class finds herself invisible the moment the cabin lights hit, her presence questioned, her worth doubted, without a word spoken. Behind the polished smiles and hushed whispers lies a ruthless undercurrent of exclusion, a silent war waged through glances and unspoken rules designed to erase her before she even takes her seat. What begins as a quiet struggle for space erupts into a storm that will expose deep-rooted injustice, and power plays no one saw coming. But the true revelation isn't the cruelty she endures, it's the secret she carries, one that will shatter the very foundations of the world trying to push her down. Follow this electrifying story of courage and upheaval. And if you're compelled by tales of resilience and hidden truths, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. As Thalassa stepped into the first-class cabin, the overhead lights dimmed just as she passed through. Behind her, soft laughter rippled like a current. No one looked directly at her, but every glance silently agreed. She didn't belong here. Her seat was stained, dried coffee, splashed deliberately. When she called a flight attendant, they silently handed her a dry napkin and walked away, never acknowledging the issue. The moment she sat down, it began, the slow, deliberate erosion of presence. Thalassa Monroe, just 16, carried herself with the hesitant pride of someone who'd never had a seat in rooms like this. Her hoodie was plain, her shoes scuffed, but her boarding pass was platinum tier, heat-stamped and pristine, issued straight from the private concierge desk of the airline. It should have meant something. It should have granted her belonging. Instead, it made her more of an anomaly. The man across the aisle, mid-50s, salt and pepper temples, adjusted his collar and turned slightly away from her. His motion wasn't rude on the surface, just subtle enough to exclude. The woman in 2B, seated beside Thalassa, pulled her designer scarf closer around her neck and leaned away just an inch, but with practiced precision. Not a single word was spoken, but the message was clear. One of these things is not like the others. Thalassa looked straight ahead, not letting her face show the embarrassment, though her ears burned. She reached for her seatbelt, only to find it twisted and stuck under the cushion. She struggled for a moment, glancing around. No one offered help. Eventually, she managed to yank it free, clipping it into place with a dull click. The flight attendant returned, her tray of pre-departure drinks perfectly aligned, her smile strained. She offered champagne to 2B, a sparkling water to the gentleman behind Thalassa, then paused. Her eyes flicked down to the name on the manifest, then up to Thalassa's face, then moved on. No offer, no eye contact, no drink. The tray passed, and so did the opportunity for acknowledgement. The blanket distribution followed. First-class blankets, custom embroidered and folded with precision, were placed in the laps of each passenger with a courteous nod. But when it came to Thalassa, the motion shifted. The attendant reached into the same bin, pulled out one folded sloppily, the corner dragging against her uniform, and tossed it, not placed, not offered, but tossed it onto the edge of Thalassa's tray. It slid halfway off, catching against her elbow. Still, not a word, not a glance. She said nothing. Instead, she gently placed the blanket in her lap, smoothing it with a care no one had offered her. As the plane taxied, Thalassa tried to settle into the experience, telling herself it was nerves, that maybe this was how people acted in first class. Distant, private, but deep down, something whispered otherwise. When the engines lifted them into the clouds, her stomach sank with the weight of being unspoken and unseen. 30 minutes in, the silence had turned suffocating. She pressed the call button. No response. Across the aisle, another passenger pressed theirs. A crew member appeared within seconds. She canceled her request. She would try again later. Maybe it was just busy. Maybe. The in-flight menu arrived in thick leather folios. The attendant handed one to 2B, one to 1A, skipped Thalassa entirely, then moved on. When the meal cart rolled down the aisle, Thalassa sat upright, waiting. One tray landed in 1B, another in 2B, a third in 3A. Then nothing. Her tray table stayed empty. The scent of seared salmon and saffron rice filled the cabin, and her stomach knotted. Finally, a different attendant approached. Young, uncertain, almost apologetic. She carried a thin cardboard box labeled with a generic airline logo, not the premium service name. She didn't speak. She set the box in front of Thalassa with the gentleness reserved for shame, then left. Inside the box was cold pasta, edges hardened, center sticky. No salad, no dessert, no silverware, just a plastic spork sealed in a bag with a moist towelette. She picked at the pasta, swallowing around the lump in her throat, eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. It was off. It never turned on. She pressed the power button, held it. Nothing. Everyone else's screens glowed. A movie played 3 rows ahead. Beside her, Tubi chuckled quietly at something on screen. Thalassa sat in silence, the dark rectangle in front of her reflecting only her own face, small and dulled. An hour passed. Then 2. When she stood to use the restroom, a passing passenger brushed her shoulder and didn't say, "Excuse me." She waited outside the lavatory for several minutes, but each time she reached to try the handle, it was locked. A crew member passed and said nothing. When it finally opened, a man stepped out and looked her up and down before walking away without acknowledgement. She stepped in. The sink was dry. The soap was out. The trash was overflowing. The mirror was cracked. A single paper towel remained, and it tore as she tried to use it. She stared at herself. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her lip trembled. She hated that it did. On the way back to her seat, someone sneezed as she passed, and she felt a deliberate pull of breath from the person in 3B. They turned their face the other way, as if protecting themselves from her existence. Returning to her seat, she found her blanket missing. No one looked at her, not even the attendants, who hovered around the aisle with practiced politeness, offering farewells to passengers by name, thanking them for their loyalty, and handing out neatly folded landing cards. None came her way. No smile. No name. Nothing. Thalassa stood once the aisle cleared, gathering her backpack from beneath the seat like it weighed twice what it had when she boarded. She walked forward, steps measured, head high despite the tremor in her chest. As she crossed the threshold out of the aircraft, she expected to feel relief, some breath of freedom from the floating prison behind her. But the terminal ahead greeted her with more of the same. The private wing was sleek, hushed, and designed for quiet opulence. Walls lined in imported wood, glass fixtures shimmering above imported tile. Staff in perfectly tailored Navy suits manned each security and reception checkpoint. A concierge desk stood at the end of a jet bridge where elite passengers were usually greeted by name, often with a driver waiting, sometimes even with refreshments. As Thalassa approached, the man behind the desk glanced at her, then at his tablet, and immediately turned his eyes back to the screen. Another passenger walked past her at the same time, and the man lit up, stepping forward with a rehearsed smile and addressing the man by name. The words "Welcome back, Mr. Vance," floated behind Thalassa as she passed, unheard but felt. She stopped briefly in front of the desk, unsure whether she should check in, ask for help, or even speak. The concierge ignored her completely, not even a blink in her direction. She turned away and kept walking, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. By the time she reached baggage claim, most passengers had already disappeared. The belt was already turning when she arrived, glossy suitcases tumbling out in slow succession. Her duffel bag was easy to spot, black canvas, old zippers, no designer label. She reached for it just as a suited man nearby raised an eyebrow and subtly stepped back, as though something unsanitary had entered the space. She didn't flinch. She just picked it up, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the exit. The car that had been arranged for her, through the same concierge that issued her premium ticket, was nowhere to be found. She checked the rideshare app. No record of a pickup. She checked her email. The confirmation was still there. The time, the name, the car service's promise of prompt arrival. All of it in writing. And yet, the designated pickup zone was filled only with black SUVs, tinted windows, and uniformed drivers holding signs. She walked past them once, scanning for her name. Nothing. On the second pass, she slowed in front of a driver with a tablet. He held the screen loosely in one hand, scrolling absent-mindedly. She cleared her throat, asking softly if he was with Falcon Private Transport. He didn't look up, just said no and shifted away. She didn't believe him. Not really, but she walked away anyway. By the time she opened the app to order a standard ride, her phone had slipped to 4%. She connected to the airport Wi-Fi, but it prompted a login screen she hadn't seen before, one reserved for exclusive tiers. The free version was down for maintenance. She sat on a bench outside the terminal, the concrete beneath her growing warmer under the morning sun. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were trembling. She wasn't even sure if she was angry or just empty. No one had touched her. No one had yelled. And yet she felt bruised from the inside out. 20 minutes later, her rideshare pulled in. The driver, a young man with a ball cap and sunglasses, didn't speak. She climbed into the back, the cool air a small mercy, and leaned against the door. The ride home was quiet. Too quiet. The traffic hummed. Her phone battery blinked red, then black. She let it die. Let the world disconnect. When they reached her neighborhood, she gave directions by memory. The driver barely acknowledged her. She paid in cash, grabbed her bag, and walked up the driveway of her father's home. It wasn't a mansion, but it was elegant. Classic brick, trimmed hedges, polished door fixtures. The kind of home that didn't shout money, but whispered it in details. She stepped inside. No one was home. She left her bag by the door, walked upstairs, and locked herself in her room. She dragged herself out of bed, showered longer than necessary, and dressed without purpose, staring through clothes she didn't care about. The airline-branded hoodie he'd gifted her for this trip, a limited edition, embroidered with an elite insignia, lay crumpled on the floor, half stepped on. She left it there. By early afternoon, her father's assistant called to remind her about the flight back. Different city, same airline. First class again. This time, she didn't feel anticipation, just cold resistance and obligation. She wanted to refuse, but she didn't know how to say no without having to explain why. She wasn't ready to explain. She wasn't even ready to think about it. So she said yes and packed quietly. The car that picked her up was sleek and silent, its driver efficient and indifferent. She was delivered to the terminal like cargo, precisely, quickly, and without conversation. When she entered the exclusive check-in lounge, the scent of citrus and leather struck her first, followed by the subtle air of surveillance. People noticed her. They didn't stare. That would be too obvious. Instead, they flicked their eyes, shifted their weight, adjusted the way they held their phones. As she approached the service desk, the attendant glanced up, then immediately looked beyond her, calling out for the next passenger, though no one stood behind her. Thalassa stood still, not defiant, not aggressive, just present. Eventually, the attendant sighed and processed her without a word, never lifting her gaze, never breaking the practiced rhythm of someone tolerating something unwelcome. With her boarding pass in hand, Thalassa moved toward the private security gate. A white-gloved officer motioned her forward, scanned her pass, and immediately requested a random secondary screening. Her shoulders tensed. The only people being pulled aside were two, herself and a man with a prosthetic leg. She complied without a word, removing her shoes, her light jacket, opening her bag. They swabbed everything, twice. A supervisor hovered nearby, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The process took 20 minutes. No one apologized. When she was finally cleared, the boarding gate had already opened. She arrived just in time to see the last few first-class passengers stepping down the jet bridge. The agent scanned her pass, frowned slightly, then asked her to wait. She did, standing to the side while business-class passengers filed past. Finally, after the plane was half full, she was allowed to board. Her seat this time was 1D, aisle near the front. The moment she entered the cabin, the warmth drained from her cheeks. The flight attendant at the door greeted everyone ahead of her with effortless grace, bright smiles, light touches on shoulders. When Thalassa approached, the woman's expression froze, not cruel, just suddenly neutral, almost clinical. The kind of face you wear when looking at something that doesn't belong. Thalassa walked to her seat and settled in, already knowing what was coming. She braced herself for the rituals of exclusion. The man beside her, mid-40s, white, well-dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, adjusted the curtain between their seats so it extended a few inches closer to his side. It wasn't enough to block her entirely, but it served its purpose. The boundary was drawn. The pre-flight drinks came again, champagne in crystal, arranged on a silver tray. The tray passed her. Again, her request button went unanswered. She didn't bother pressing it a second time. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her e-reader, and tried to dissolve into the glow of words. It didn't work. A little girl across the aisle leaned over and began staring at her, not with curiosity, but with a strange intensity, as if watching a stranger speak a foreign language. When Thalassa glanced over, the child whispered something to her father. The man chuckled and said something back. Neither looked ashamed. Then the girl pulled out a crayon and began drawing in her notebook, occasionally glancing up at Thalassa. She could see her own likeness forming on the page, round face, thick brows, and a heavy frown exaggerated in orange marker. The cabin filled with soft laughter. It wasn't loud, just enough to be felt. When the flight began taxiing, Thalassa closed her eyes. Maybe sleep would shield her. Maybe if she pretended to drift off, they would leave her alone. But sleep didn't come. Not when the attendant adjusted her overhead bin without asking, crushing her hoodie beneath a stranger's carry-on. Not when her armrest disappeared under the steady sprawl of her seatmate's elbow. Not when her tray table failed to unlock because the passenger in front had jammed their briefcase under their seat and refused to move it. She asked once. He didn't hear, or pretended not to. The meal service brought new games. The passengers received hand-printed menus on embossed paper. She did not. Instead, the attendant told her the options aloud, monotone, eyes elsewhere. When the meals arrived, her tray came last. The chicken was cold, the bread already hardening. No butter, no dessert, no cloth napkin. The others had folded linen, polished silverware, curated bites arranged like artwork. Hers was a tray of leftovers. She ate slowly, deliberately. Every bite was another exercise in restraint. Somewhere between the second hour and the third, a turbulence warning came over the speaker. Passengers were asked to remain seated. Thalassa reached into the seat pocket to retrieve the safety card and found it missing. The terminal at Landry International was vast, lined with designer storefronts, marble-tiled floors, and framed photos of celebrity travelers who'd flown the airline's premium service. As she passed one frame near the luxury lounge, her eyes caught a photo of a young white girl about her age, smiling with a flight attendant, a glass of sparkling water in hand. Blanket draped perfectly over her lap. The caption beneath read, "Our youngest elite flyer excellence knows no age." Thalassa looked away and walked faster. Her driver was late again. She waited outside under the shaded canopy while chauffeurs greeted others by name, offering ice towels and phone chargers. One even had a bouquet. For her, nothing. When the black sedan finally pulled in 20 minutes later, the man inside didn't step out. He popped the trunk remotely and nodded at her through the rearview mirror. She opened her own door and climbed in, not bothering to speak. The ride to the hotel was silent but far from peaceful. She couldn't stop replaying every second of the flight, the elbow taking her armrest, the crayon drawing that reduced her to a caricature, the missing safety card, the absence of basic acknowledgement. Even when turbulence hit, no one had looked at her, as if she were somehow not subject to the same physical laws. When the car pulled up to the hotel, a historic building in the center of the city's financial district, the valet walked past her and opened the door for a businessman exiting a different car. She got out on her own, pulled her own bag, and entered the lobby, where the concierge looked at her, then turned to take a phone call. At the check-in counter, the receptionist scanned her reservation and raised an eyebrow before typing, then typing again, then frowning. Thalassa waited. The woman finally said the room was not yet available, despite the reservation indicating a guaranteed early check-in. The lobby filled with other guests arriving later, most of whom were checked in immediately, given welcome drinks and personal greetings. One man with a gold pin on his lapel was even escorted to a private elevator. Thalassa sat in the corner of the lobby watching. After an hour, her room became available, but the receptionist made no apology, no welcome, just handed her a key card without a word. Her room was clean but cold, in a far corner of the hallway near the utility closet. The carpet outside her door was worn, the overhead light flickering. She entered, dropped her bag, and stood in silence. The view faced a concrete wall. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank TV screen. The silence grew. That night, a reception was being held in the ballroom 2 floors down, a celebration for elite travelers of the airline, including a few high-profile executives. Thalassa had been told weeks ago that she'd be welcome to attend as a guest, a nod to her father's influence, a chance to meet people, to be seen. But now, after everything, she wasn't sure she could walk into another room filled with smiles that didn't reach eyes and words that masked disdain. Still, she dressed, not because she wanted to be there, but because she couldn't stand the idea of letting them erase her without at least being seen. She wore a deep navy dress, modest, simple, elegant. She pulled her curls into a bun and applied a light touch of lip gloss, just enough to feel like herself. When she arrived at the ballroom entrance, the woman at the check-in table looked at her name, then down at the list, then up again with a furrowed brow. After a pause, she said Thalassa's name was not on the list. Thalassa explained calmly that she had received an invitation that her father's assistant had confirmed. The woman gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked her to step aside. She did. People walked past her as she stood there, smiling at the attendants, being welcomed by name, escorted inside with praise. After 10 minutes, the attendant said she still couldn't verify the registration and offered her a seat at the edge of the room, technically outside the event, but within view of the celebration. Thalassa declined. She walked to the other end of the corridor and sat alone on a velvet bench. Music from the ballroom filtered through the walls, bright and full of laughter. She sat with her back straight, hands folded, jaw tight. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not again. Eventually, a woman came by and offered her a glass of water, clearly unsure whether Thalassa was part of the staff or a lost guest. The driver didn't speak. She didn't speak. When they arrived at the private terminal, she stepped out and pulled her own bag again, ignoring the polished porters who glanced away and quickly looked through her as if she were nothing more than background movement. The interior of the terminal gleamed as before marble chrome brushed brass, and the check-in area smelled faintly of eucalyptus and wealth. She stepped up to the elite counter and offered her passport and confirmation number. The man behind the desk took them with a practiced smile that melted into confusion when he tapped at a screen. His brow furrowed. He clicked again, then again. After a long pause, he asked her to step aside while they resolved the discrepancy. She waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Behind her, other passengers checked in without issue. They were welcomed with cheerful greetings, luggage swiftly tagged and carried off, itineraries confirmed with flawless precision. Eventually, a manager emerged and informed her that while her reservation was valid, there had been a system error and her seat assignment had been lost. They could still accommodate her, of course, but her original first-class seat was no longer available. Instead, she would be placed in the back row of the premium economy cabin, row 35, aisle. No apology, no offer of compensation. Just a cold explanation wrapped in corporate politeness. She asked calmly if there was any way to resolve it, but the manager responded with a dismissive shrug and a clipboard. Thalassa took the new boarding pass without another word. At security, she was again flagged for a random search. Her bag was unpacked in full view of passing travelers. A wrapped feminine hygiene product was pulled out and examined. A worn book was flipped through page by page. Her clothes were unfolded and left that way. She tried to gather them back together with some dignity, but her face flushed hot as the agent moved without urgency. Once she finally reached her gate, she was exhausted, and her flight hadn't even started. At boarding, Her zone was called last. The line moved slowly, inching forward while airline staff offered wide smiles and bottled water to passengers ahead. When she handed over her boarding pass, the scanner beeped sharply. The agent frowned and waved over a colleague. The two whispered, "Another delay, another quiet humiliation." The system needed to re-verify her identity, they said. She was asked to step aside while the rest of the passengers boarded. 10 minutes later, they cleared her with a nod and handed her a reprinted pass. No eye contact, no acknowledgement of the delay, no apology. She walked down the jet bridge alone, arriving at the back of the plane where her row sat beside the bathroom, the overhead bins already stuffed full. She tried to find space for her bag, but every compartment was jammed. The attendant told her, without smiling, that she'd need to check it now. It would arrive with general luggage. She protested that it contained a medical item, her inhaler, but the attendant only shrugged and said it would be retrieved quickly if needed. Thalassa didn't argue. She couldn't afford to. She handed over her bag and slid into her narrow seat. The passenger beside her, an older woman with a designer handbag, glanced at her hoodie and immediately turned toward the aisle. The window passenger was already asleep. The air was stale, the temperature too warm. She folded her arms and leaned her head back, wishing she were invisible. The in-flight entertainment screen in front of her was scratched. The touch sensitivity barely worked. When she finally managed to pull up the movie selection, most of the titles were locked behind a paywall unless she entered a code from her original ticket class, which she no longer had. Her earbuds didn't fit the jack provided. She gave up. When the snack cart rolled down the aisle, the attendant passed her row entirely. Thalassa raised her hand. The cart kept rolling. Minutes later, she saw other passengers unwrapping sandwiches and fruit cups. She pressed the call button. No response. She pressed it again. Nothing. The passenger across the aisle caught her eye, gave a half smirk, then turned away. Eventually, she flagged down a passing crew member and asked quietly if she could have a snack. The attendant looked confused, checked the manifest, then shook his head. Her meal had been canceled due to a downgraded fare class. Her throat tightened, but she nodded and thanked him anyway. When the beverage cart came, she requested water. The attendant handed her a half-filled cup with a cracked rim. The water inside had visible bubbles, as if it had been sitting out. She drank it anyway. Hours passed. The lights dimmed. The bathroom line grew. The one nearest her row began to smell. She tried to sleep, but her seat didn't recline. Her neighbors did. With every bump of turbulence, her elbow was jostled. Her tray table was sticky. Her headrest cushion detached halfway through the flight. She reported it. Nothing was done. When the plane began its descent, the captain came on with an announcement about their on-time arrival, thanking passengers for choosing the airline. As she passed a row of interactive screens promoting the airline's premium loyalty program, she caught her reflection. Disheveled hoodie, dull eyes, tense shoulders, the kind of posture that told the world she expected resistance, even from her own shadow. She turned away and kept walking. In the baggage claim area, passengers gathered in clusters around the carousel, their voices light, their complaints superficial. Someone joked about their suitcase being too heavy from all the shopping. Someone else laughed about missing the lounge drinks. Thalassa stood quietly at the edge, waiting. Her bag took the longest to appear, thrown out near the end of a cycle, its tag hanging by a single thread. When she retrieved it, she found the zipper partially open. Inside, her books had shifted, and a small bottle of face wash had exploded, soaking one corner of her clothes. No one offered help. No one noticed. She repacked it on the floor beside the belt, surrounded by designer luggage that gleamed under overhead lights. As she exited the airport, a line of chauffeurs held signs with names written in elegant calligraphy. None of them were for her. Again, she sighed and called a rideshare. It was a 15-minute wait. The driver arrived late and scowled when she asked for help with her bag. She didn't press it. She simply got in and shut the door, silence her armor. At the hotel, things escalated. Her reservation had been modified. Instead of the executive suite she was promised, another courtesy extended due to her father's silent influence. She was assigned a standard room. The woman behind the front desk claimed there had been a reallocation due to demand. The words sounded rehearsed. Thalassa didn't argue. She knew it wouldn't help. The room was clean but uninspired. No welcome card. No amenities. No explanation. She dropped her bag and collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. When she opened her social media later that night, what she saw hit harder than any cold tray of airplane food or skip service. There it was, a blurry photo, uploaded by another passenger from her last flight. The image had been taken from across the aisle, angled deliberately to capture Thalassa mid-yawn, her hoodie wrinkled, her eyes half-lidded with fatigue. The caption read, "First class isn't what it used to be," followed by a laughing emoji and the airline's hashtag. Dozens of comments followed. Some laughed. Some speculated. One asked, "Is she lost?" Another replied, "Affirmative action gone too far." She closed the app, her heart pounding. Her face was being passed around as a joke, as a symbol of what didn't belong, and no one knew she was. No one cared. A few hours later, as if mocking her further, a corporate email landed in her inbox. It was from the airline, a mass-distributed promotional blast celebrating their Year of Elegance campaign. Attached was a curated video of model passengers, flawless, diverse in a manufactured way, laughing with uniformed staff in ultra-polished cabins. Thalassa was not in any of it. Not people like her. Not the way she'd looked. The video included a testimonial from a frequent flyer. "Altair always makes me feel like I matter." Thalassa didn't delete the email. She marked it as unread. Let it sit there, as if it could shame itself. The next day, things became worse. As she made her way through the hotel lobby to get breakfast, she passed a group of flight attendants who had clearly just checked in for their layover. One of them nudged another and whispered. The others laughed. One pulled out a phone and held it low, angled toward Thalassa. She wasn't sure if a photo had been taken, but the intent was obvious. She turned and walked the other way. She didn't eat. By the time she returned to her room, she found a note slipped under the door. It wasn't from hotel staff. It was handwritten on hotel stationery. "Maybe you should stick to economy where you belong." No signature, no explanation, just that. The words didn't shout. They whispered, insidious and sure of themselves. Thalassa held the paper, her fingers curling around the edge. She stared at the words long enough for them to blur. She didn't cry. Not then. She folded it neatly and tucked it into her backpack, beneath the ruined face wash, next to her unread book. She didn't tell her father. Not yet. What could she say? That she had been treated like a joke by strangers? That her presence invited mockery not because of anything she did, but simply because of what she looked like? Because she didn't match their idea of belonging? Because her boarding pass was platinum, but her skin wasn't porcelain? She turned on the news that evening out of habit. A feature story aired about women in aviation leadership. One of the featured executives was a woman named Claudia Rains, a senior flight director with Altair. The segment praised her for championing diversity and innovation in flight service. She didn't know what today would bring, but she felt something stirring beneath her skin, a pulse not quite rage, not quite fear, but something colder, more resolute. She got dressed with care this time, not because she wanted to be noticed, but because she finally understood the rules of the game. Every piece of her appearance would be evaluated, weaponized, filed away. So she selected a dark gray suit jacket with subtle structure, a clean white shirt, pressed trousers. It was not a costume. It was armor. Her flight was scheduled for mid-morning, another high-status route, another branded gesture from her father's, circle meant to be a soft reward for enduring the elite world she was born into but never accepted by. She didn't pack much, just the essentials. Her ruined hoodie, still stained from her prior flight, she left on the hotel room chair like an old skin she no longer needed. When she arrived at the terminal, the staff registered her with the same hesitant efficiency, still too polite to be outright rude, still too rehearsed to be sincere. The check-in process went quickly, suspiciously so. No small talk. No welcome back. Just the kind of corporate neutrality designed to discourage confrontation while continuing the same quiet campaign of dismissal. Security was uneventful this time, but not because they had changed. It was because she had stopped hoping for decency. She passed through the lounge and ignored the stairs, didn't bother attempting to enter even though her status would have allowed it. She simply walked past it through the private gate and into the boarding area, where an attendant glanced at her ticket, then back at her face, before mumbling, "We'll be boarding groups shortly." First class was already boarding. She had a first-class ticket. She didn't move. She stood still, silent, watching. The attendant called another group, families with children, then business travelers. She held out her ticket deliberately. The attendant scanned it and blinked. A moment of flickering confusion passed behind her eyes. Then she stepped aside with the same half-smile Thalassa had learned to decipher. Toleration, not welcome. As she walked down the jet bridge, she didn't feel apprehensive anymore. She felt clinical, detached. This was a laboratory now, a test. And this time, she would observe. The moment she entered the cabin, she was hit again by the now familiar wall of subtle disapproval. She moved through it without pause. Her seat was 1A. The left window seat, first row, directly beneath the flagship airline logo. She sat and settled in without hesitation. She fastened her seatbelt. She kept her eyes forward. The man across from her gave her a once-over, the kind that suggested he was calculating what anomaly she represented. She ignored it. The crew began preparing for takeoff. The lead flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking on each passenger. She stopped at 1B, smiled, complimented the passenger's tie. At 1C, she offered an extra blanket. Then she passed Thalassa without a glance. Again. But this time, Thalassa didn't shrink. She spoke, calm and clear. "Excuse me, could I have a water, please?" The attendant froze mid-step, as if startled that she had spoken. Then turned, smiled too tightly, and nodded. The water never came. Thalassa didn't ask again. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a slim black case. Inside was a metal ID card, not issued by the airline, not promotional. It was old, with faint wear along the edges. On it was a gold-embossed name, Eric Monroe, owner Altaris Holdings. Her father. The card had no functional purpose here. It wouldn't unlock upgrades or grant lounge access. It wasn't meant to be seen. But now, she laid it on her tray table, as if by accident, face up. She placed her phone beside it and opened a business news site. The headline she had saved hours ago glared back at her. Altaris Holdings completes acquisition of commercial airline in $6.2 billion deal. She scrolled slowly, not because she needed to read it again, but because she wanted them to see it. She adjusted the brightness on her phone screen until it was clearly visible to anyone walking past. For a while, nothing happened. Then the energy around her began to change. The flight attendant who had ignored her earlier returned with a forced smile and a glass of mineral water on a silver tray. "So sorry for the delay," she said. Her tone was stiff. The digital displays embedded in the seatbacks blinked briefly, then switched to a special broadcast. The screen lit up with the airline's corporate colors and logo, but the content was different from the usual safety video or promotional reel. It was an announcement, official and unmistakable. The voice that followed was steady, authoritative, and familiar to those who worked in corporate circles. The camera panned over images of boardrooms, handshake agreements, and logos merging together until the screen focused on a signature embossed on a leather-bound portfolio, the initials TM shining in gold. A date appeared beneath, the very day of this flight. Then the screen showed a stylized graphic of the airline's newest fleet, bearing the insignia of Altaris Holdings. The voiceover announced the completion of a historic acquisition and named Thalassa Eden Monroe as the youngest controlling shareholder and executive board member in the airline's history. The cabin remained quiet but heavy with tension. Passengers shifted in their seats, and crew members exchanged subtle glances. Then, unexpectedly, the captain's voice came over the intercom with a new warmth. An unmistakable pride threaded into his words as he welcomed everyone aboard the first flight under new leadership. The announcement was short but deliberate. It made no mention of Thalassa by name, but the implication was clear to everyone who had been paying attention. At that moment, a stewardess appeared at Thalassa's seat, holding an embossed envelope sealed with a red wax emblem, the kind reserved for official correspondence and ceremonial occasions. She handed it to Thalassa with a bow so slight it could have been missed, but it was there. The envelope was heavy in her hands. She opened it quietly, revealing a letter of personal welcome from the airline's board and a badge, a pin crafted in gold and sapphire, the airline's emblem intertwined with the Monroe family crest. Nearby passengers looked on, some with surprise, others with thinly veiled admiration or jealousy. The woman seated next to Thalassa, who had earlier seemed indifferent, suddenly straightened and offered a tentative smile, a silent acknowledgement that things had changed. Crew members adjusted their demeanor, their gestures more respectful, the way they addressed her more formal, as if she were no longer a passenger but a dignitary. Cameras discreetly recorded the scene, some belonging to passengers, some to the crew, but none tried to hide their presence. The story was already shifting in real time. Outside the window, the clouds parted to reveal the sun breaking through, casting golden light across the cabin. Thalassa caught her own reflection in the glass, steady and unyielding, and felt a sense of calm purpose settle within her. She knew this was only the beginning. By the time the plane began its descent, whispers had turned to conversations. A few passengers approached the flight attendants, asking for clarifications about the announcement, eager to understand the woman who had been at the center of the subtle storm during the flight. The crew responded with rehearsed but genuine pride, speaking carefully about the new chapter for the airline, about legacy and progress and the vision that Thalassa embodied. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain updated air traffic control with a steady voice, his tone carrying the weight of responsibility and optimism. When the plane touched down, the runway lights flashed under the wheels as the cabin filled with soft applause, not just polite but heartfelt, from the passengers who recognized the historic nature of the moment. Thalassa allowed herself a small smile as she gathered her belongings. She stood to disembark last, not out of humility, but because she knew her exit would be noticed. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone steady but carrying an unfamiliar edge of formality as he announced that, due to security protocols associated with the new leadership's presence, certain areas of the airport and aircraft would remain closed for additional inspection and review. The announcement caught some passengers off guard, others nodded knowingly, their expressions guarded but expectant. Flight attendants moved quickly but carefully through the aisles, preparing passengers for a slightly delayed disembarkation. At the same time, a hushed but palpable tension gripped the entire crew. Cameras discreetly recorded every movement, every exchange. Near the front of the cabin, Claudia, the senior flight attendant whose dismissive treatment of Thalassa had once been a source of quiet torment, sat rigidly with a face drained of color. She stared blankly at her hands, fingers trembling slightly, her mind racing to comprehend the storm her actions had helped set into motion. Two other attendants sat beside her, equally pale and subdued, exchanging worried looks. The captain, ever the stoic leader, met with members of the airline's corporate security team who had boarded the plane shortly after takeoff. Their briefing was curt and decisive. Violations of service protocols, failures to uphold the standards of passenger treatment, and specifically documented incidents involving the passenger now known as Thalassa Monroe had been recorded and flagged for immediate investigation. The consequences were swift and unambiguous. As the plane taxied to the gate, announcements instructed all passengers to remain seated until cleared by security personnel. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to be felt, a collective holding of breath as the airline prepared to reckon with the fallout. Claudia was among the first to be approached by security officers as they boarded the plane. She was requested to surrender her identification badge and uniform jacket immediately. Her protests were quiet, almost inaudible, and met with firm refusal. She was escorted off the aircraft alongside two other attendants who had been implicated in the incidents. Passengers watched in silence, some whispering, others pulling out phones to document the unprecedented scene. Among those passengers was a young woman who began live streaming the event with the hashtag Justice for Thalassa. The stream quickly gained traction online, drawing support and condemnation in equal measure. News outlets began covering the story as breaking news, with headlines focusing on the airline's commitment to addressing discrimination and the accountability of its staff. Inside the aircraft, the mood had shifted from polite curiosity to one of vindication and cautious optimism. Crew members who had earlier avoided eye contact now offered apologies and assistance to Thalassa. She accepted none of it outright, her expression unreadable. Instead, she quietly gathered her belongings, preparing to disembark as the cabin door opened and security personnel escorted the disciplined attendants away. Outside, waiting at the jet bridge, was a contingent of senior executives from Alteris Holdings, including several board members who had flown in specifically to oversee the situation. Cameras flashed as Thalassa stepped down the stairs, greeted by applause from a gathering of employees and media. A spokesperson for the airline made a public statement praising Thalassa's courage and affirming the company's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and mistreatment. The statement promised comprehensive reforms, mandatory sensitivity training, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. Backstage, Claudia and the other implicated attendants faced immediate suspension pending further investigation. Their reputations, carefully constructed over years, lay in ruins before a public suddenly unwilling to tolerate the old ways. Social media exploded with support for Thalassa and calls for systemic change within the airline industry. The story became a catalyst for broader conversations about race, privilege, and accountability in elite spaces. For Thalassa herself, the moment was bittersweet. The public vindication could not erase the quiet pain she had endured, the whispered comments, the exclusion, the hours of feeling unseen and unworthy. But it marked a turning point. The morning light filtered gently through the tall windows of the Alteris Air corporate headquarters, casting long shadows over the polished marble floors where decisions were made and futures were shaped. Thalassa Monroe stood quietly in the main lobby, a figure both familiar and transformed. Her posture was calm, her gaze steady, but there was an undeniable weight behind her eyes, one forged not from anger, but from resilience. Word of the previous day's events had spread like wildfire. The airline was under intense scrutiny, their responses carefully monitored by media outlets, advocacy groups, and customers worldwide. Yet, amidst the chaos, in this vast, echoing space filled with portraits of past leaders and company milestones, Thalassa found a moment of stillness. She had come here not as a guest, but as a symbol of change, and as a guardian of the dignity so often denied to those who looked like her. As she moved through the corridors, employees and executives alike paused to acknowledge her presence, not with empty nods or forced smiles, but with genuine respect. The tension that once marked her interactions with staff had dissolved into an understanding that the company was entering a new chapter. In the spacious conference room, the board of directors assembled, their faces a mixture of solemnity and determination. The CEO opened the meeting with a clear statement. The airline would implement comprehensive reforms to eliminate discrimination and elevate inclusivity at every level. Training programs would be overhauled, new leadership positions created for diversity and equity officers, and an independent advisory council formed to hold the company accountable. Thalassa was invited to join this council, her voice not just heard but sought after. She accepted with a quiet nod, knowing that true change required more than statements. It required action. Later that afternoon, she addressed a room filled with journalists, activists, employees, and fellow travelers. Her words were measured but powerful, each sentence carrying the weight of lived experience and unyielding hope. She spoke of the invisible battles fought by so many, of the moments when dignity was stripped away not by force, but by silence, neglect, and prejudice. Yet she also spoke of possibility, the power in reclaiming one's narrative, in transforming pain into progress. Outside the building, supporters gathered, holding signs with messages of solidarity and justice. Their cheers and applause were a chorus for change, a call for an industry, and a society that truly valued every individual. Thalassa stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the weight of the past lifting slightly as she met their eyes, feeling the strength of a community that refused to be silenced. Later, as dusk settled over the city, she returned home to the house that had once felt like a fortress of quiet expectation. This time, she entered with confidence, greeted by her father's embrace, a moment of shared understanding and mutual respect. Together, they discussed the future, not just of the airline, but of the legacy they wanted to build. As night deepened, Thalassa sat by her window, looking out at the stars scattered across the sky. She thought about the journey, the trials, the setbacks, the moments of isolation, and the sudden flashes of recognition. The sky, vast and unyielding, had once seemed distant, unattainable. Now, it felt like a promise. In the silence, she whispered a vow, not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever been pushed aside or made to feel invisible, that no one would ever have to fight alone. The next day, as the first flight under Alteris Air's renewed vision took off, a message appeared across the sky, written in smoke and light, visible to all below. You tried to erase her. Now she owns the sky. The message was not loud, not brash, but it was unmistakable. Justice had arrived, not with a shout, but with the quiet certainty of a dawn breaking over the horizon. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more gripping, meaningful tales, please like and subscribe so you never miss an update. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot. Did any part surprise or move you? And where are you watching from? Share your thoughts and location in the comments below to join the conversation.